I'm going to talk to you about cabbage tree hats today. When we were on Norfolk, I learnt to make the traditional Norfolk hats, which were largely made out of pandanus, which is a leaf that we imported from the islands. Quite a lot of preparation, we used to buy that in. But hats were also made from the drain flax, which is kumbunji, from corn husk, banana bark, M'u, which is a blady grass, very, very sharp. You had to use leather gloves when you were collecting that. But the pandanus is very solid. You can feel that. But when we came back to Australia, Don had always been singing about cabbage tree hats. And so we decided to research cabbage tree hats. And we found that a cabbage tree hat was very much like a boater, but very light. It had a flat top and traditionally a black velvet band. They are very light, and one of the advantages of them is that when it's dry, they open slightly and so they let in the air. But when it's wet, the leaf expands and it closes the hole so they become waterproof. Now, so cabbage trees. Cabbage tree palms are found all along the east coast of Australia between the coast or the coastline and the mountains, mainly in remnant rainforest. And the part that you use for making a cabbage tree hat is the unopened leaf spear. We looked on Trove and found that there was a really good description of how they made cabbage tree hats in a 1901 journal from the Royal Australian Historical Society. And looking further, we found a lot of evidence in local papers of their being made throughout the Illawarra and up at Kurrajong. The method initially was they would cut down the palm tree. Now that is horribly wasteful, except that they used the trunks as guttering. So it wasn't quite as wasteful. But today we cut the leaf spear, and this was the method given in 1901. You cut the unopened leaf spear. Now it does not kill the plant. It's not like taking out the heart of the palm, because you take it once it's already emerged. You then boil that leaf spear for 10 minutes to half an hour, and you open it and you dry it. After it's dried, you dip it in hot water. And here we have a leaf which has been dried and dipped in hot water, and it's now flexible again. Don and I iron the leaves at this point because that kills any mould and it allows you to store them much better. It does slightly improve the quality of the hat, but it's not really significant. It's mainly so that we can pre-prepare leaves. To make the hat, you then strip out the midrib. Right, so I've taken the leaf in half. And you use a cutter. Cabbage tree palm doesn't have a parallel enough vein or vein system to allow you to just cut them with a pin. And the cutter was very well described in old newspapers, and this is a replica that Don has made from one that was found in a rat's nest under the floor of Hyde Park Barracks. So in those days, these points were made from sharpened stay busks, but today these are craft knife blades. So to strip it, I should show you the other modern one, which is a beautiful tool. This is an Hawaiian stripper, and they're craft knife blades, and you can set to different widths that you want. Right, stripping with the old one, the replica. It's a very simple technique. But by doing that, it enables you to get repetitive strands the same width. Using the modern stripper is very similar. sorry, take out the midrib. And once again, you get 2, or if you've got a large leaf, 3 or 4 pieces of the correct width. Now, after that, you start the plaiting. And the plaiting is the same type of plait that was taught to convicts in the hulks and went round the Pacific with whalers. So though on Norfolk it is considered part of their heritage, that is because it was taken to Norfolk Island by the Pitcairners in 1856. And I learnt this from Wayne Boniface and Greg Magri, both of whom had learnt it from their grandmothers. So you take 2 pieces, cross them over, and you start to weave. Now, after that first piece, the weave has only 2 different steps. You go over the middle one, under the outside one. Then from the same side, we go over one, under one. Same side, over the 2 middle ones, under the outside one. Then from the other side now, I go over one, under one, over 2, under one. And there are records of children doing this on the way to and from school, whole families involved during the Depression, and families were paid 10 shillings 100 yards of plait, because you could make up the plait in advance to be later sewn into a hat. So that's all that's involved in the plait. Hats of different fineness are made by using different widths of the material. This hat here is made from that width, which is about 5.5 mil. And so that plait is from this. This hat here is from a much finer cut. And so here we have a leaf, and the one leaf here gives me 5 strands because it's finer. And if I plait that one up, which was cut on the narrow blades of this, I end up with a plait of that width. So you can see the difference when I find the difference between the 2 weaves is purely determined by the width of the way you cut the leaf. So there we have the 2. This one will take about 100 yards or 90 metres of what we call sennet to make a hat, whereas this one will take 25 to 30. So there's quite a big difference. The oldest record of a very fine hat we've found had, I think it was 300 yards of sennet in it. That one was presented to Albert, the Prince of Wales, in 1860. He took it back to England, or he's thought to have, and though we've tried to follow it up through the Royal Collection, etc., there's no record of what happened to it. So it would have taken someone many months to produce. So after you have all of this, as you make it, you just wind it onto a pair of plates, or just hold it together with rubber bands. After you do that, you start to sew. And you start at the centre of the hat, and you sew round and round and round and round and round and round and round until you get to the edge of the crown. Then by tightening the tension on your stitching, you turn it down so that you go straight down the sides. And when you get to the brim, you loosen your tension of stitching so that it flares out. And once this is ironed, you'll be able to have a nice flat brim. Stitching has to be done so that you catch every corner of it, so that you can either just do it in a running stitch, or you can do it so that you conceal your stitches. And on the fine hat, I've used a running stitch, mainly because you can't see it, but on the larger weave, I've used concealed stitches. You then put the hat onto a hat block. You don't have to do this, but it makes it much easier. Wet it and iron it into shape, so that at that point this will all come out and you'll have a beautifully even hat, which you then give away. A little bit of history of them. The very first reference to cabbage tree hats in Australia is 1799 with Flinders, where it was recorded in Collins's diary that an Aborigine, who he called a native, took a stick and tried to knock Flinders' hat off his head because he wanted it, and created great laughter. So that's the oldest reference to a cabbage tree hat. Cabbage tree hats, though, they're a very standard design and are made in many places according to what the local material is. They became the most common hat in Australia prior to machine-made hats in the 1930s. If you look at any of the photos of the bushrangers, Ben Hall, Clark, the Hall gang generally, they were photographed with their hats, generally after they'd been arrested. But descriptions of the felons when they were looking for them, after things like the holding up of the pub at Paddy's River, it describes the hat that the man was wearing. And there's one description where the hat description is described in far greater detail than the man. So they were very, very common. They weren't just worn by the lower classes. At the opening of the Herberton Railway, the photograph there shows many of the people wearing cabbage tree hats. They were worn at all parts of the society. They were often made as a cottage industry, and shepherds would make them, because all you needed to make them was a knife, a bit of the supply of the spears, which you could collect and take with you, boil them up, then dry them, re-dip them, cut them and plait them. You'd needed a knife and you needed a needle and some thread. And the thread could be the midrib that you took from the cabbage tree palm leaf. That could only be used on fairly coarse weaves though. So that they were sold at about £1 each. So it was not bad money, or a cash income for people at home. Women would make them at night. Stockmen would come in from the outer reaches, especially when they were going to Homebush with cattle. They'd order them at Kurrajong on the way through and collect them on the way back. And there's records of people at local horse races going up to someone saying, "Where did you get your hat?" and making an offer for it. Because often they would have one for good wear and an old one that they wore until the old one wore out and the good one became the old one. And so that they were remarkably resilient. They would last 3, 4, 5 years of wearing every day. So that, though they look flimsy, you can do that with them, they were quite strong. Unfortunately, machinery came in, felt hats with the rabbit plague and the akubra took over, and hats which had been trading for up to £5 each stopped being the main thing, and that killed the industry. There, in 1932, there was a record in the newspaper of how to try to get the Kurrajong industry revitalised, because in 1930 families had been earning good money just from making the Senate. But digressing back, Henry Keck, who was the director of the jail at Darlinghurst, he was a businessman, rogue, but he was having his men making up to 200 cabbage tree hats a week, which he was selling, along with a lot of other things that his his prisoners were doing. So Henry Keck had a very nice little business going there with the hats, and he was earning. The men earned some money, which unfortunately was used on the female prisoners. So they wouldn't have been so happy about the cabbage tree hat industry. But it was a huge industry as a cottage industry. Presented to royalty, exhibited at some of the major exhibitions around the world, and it's been described as the first piece of apparel which was purely of Australian origin. So the cabbage tree hat, an industry that should be revived.